Welcome everybody, this is Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors.
And this is Kevin Gordon, President of Capital Advisors Group.
We'd like to welcome you to our K-12 Politics and Tech video series.
Our objective is to give you the absolute latest of what's going on in Sacramento that affects public school districts, obviously, and as well as all the technology stuff that's going on that's so vital to delivering for kids these days.
And remember, if you find these videos useful, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and share out over social media. You're our marketing team. We appreciate your support, and let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody, Tim Watrous, President of Digital Advisors, back with another episode of K-12 Politics and Tech. As always, co-host of the show, Kevin Gordon. Glad you're here, President of Capital Advisors, and another big week.
Yep, it's going to be the final week before we get a budget, hopefully next Tuesday.
All right, fingers crossed. And one of the founding partners of Capital Advisors, Barrett Snyder, also joining us. Barrett, glad you're here this week.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, so there's some pretty heavy-duty discussion in Sacramento right now around independent study and distance learning. Can you fill everybody in on what's going on there?
Yeah, so it's the major policy issue in the budget for schools that I think is still the most contentious beyond the numbers and the funding levels. The legislature and the governor are pretty intent on responding to what they saw as distance learning run amok generally during the pandemic, and want to make some fairly significant changes at the last minute to independent study. The implications of that are you've got schools all over the state that have built programs for next year and offered solutions to parents. Changing the rules at this point, which would take effect immediately, could put in jeopardy a lot of programs at the beginning of the year, and some of those that start in the summer. So for example, the changes will go into effect upon signature of the governor and trigger potentially a bunch of programs that begin on July 1. For example, I know Orange County Office of Ed has 8,000 kids enrolled in an independent study program starting July 1st. If you change the rules, that program would not receive funding to run that program, and the county office, I think, would be put in a position of having to figure out how to make that work if it could. So that just also would create a lot of angry parents. And so we're pushing for some time to make changes, but also, depending on how these changes are enacted, it could preclude independent study from even being an option for a bunch of kids for some of the compliance that they're looking for, like requiring that teachers and staff talk to kids every day. That doesn't work for kids that are maybe medically fragile or work full time some days, and for other circumstances, and why we created the law 40 years ago, and it works the way it does. So we're working. I would say one remarkable thing is that labor groups, management groups, and charter school groups, we are all in the same boat, rowing in the same direction on this issue, which is not something you see terribly often in Sacramento. It's a literal kumbaya here. So we're trying to work on the legislature to get them to work with the administration to fix that before the budget is done. It's a trailer bill item, so it's not necessarily subject to this June 15th deadline. They can drag this out a little bit longer, but it's an element of the overall discussions about what's going on in the state budget right now. So we're working on this, and everybody, all the statewide, ACTA, CSBA, CSESA, everybody. So anyway.
Barrett, do you see them, because rumor is that they may try to provide a little more flexibility in the upper grades as opposed to the elementary grades? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say in the beginning of these conversations with legislators and staff, they weren't real open to providing alternatives. I think they've come around some, at least for high school and middle school grades. They have a lot of concern around elementary grades. There's been a lot of talk in the last couple of years around these homeschool charter school models where some kids, at least it's alleged, don't talk to adults more than maybe once every 20 some odd days, and they don't like that. And so what I suspect may come out is some alternative where there's a lot more flexibility at high school, middle school, but at the elementary grades, they create cohorts and they require a little more check-in. But anyway, we're also pushing them to consider, maybe daily interaction is the default, but that parents and teachers can determine locally if that, interaction cadence doesn't work for a child for the reasons I mentioned. They're medically fragile, they're working, all kinds of reasons that they can determine locally a different cadence that works for them. So just trying to keep these options open so we're not pushing kids out of school or making them look at private schools when they really want a public school option. So that's something going on. What we're looking for right now is a lot of outreach from educators to legislators to, if superintendents and school board members, if CBOs have relationships with legislators, reach out, tell your story, talk about why having these accommodations for kids are really important. So anyway, that's just a hot issue right now. We don't have a lot of clarity. We're at this awkward point in the budget negotiation process where it's kind of all gone behind closed doors between the governor, the pro tem, and the speaker and their senior staff. And it's hard to get any intel right now. But pushing hard to make sure your story's being told would be very helpful.
So in terms of the language people use, Barrett, you made a comment about accommodation. Is that's the better word than what, flexibility or?
Right. I purposely didn't use the word flexibility because they don't like the word flexibility.
Got it.
But when what we're really talking about are accommodations for kids that have unique circumstances, and so that word tends to work better.
Right. Super
Yeah.
good. Well, thanks a lot on all of that. And I know you got to run.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Barrett, and keep us posted. Obviously, tight timelines with summer school looming and people preparing for the fall. So we'll look forward to an update and providing something next week if something comes up there.
You got it. Thanks, you guys. Take care. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Yeah. And Kevin, moving on, still staying in Sacramento. So, Cal OSHA, CDPH, there's policies impacting schools. Can you fill us in on what's going on there, please?
Yeah, and this is an issue that Barrett was also involved with. He stayed up late last night listening to the most recent Cal OSHA meeting that went into the evening time, well into the evening time, because we thought there might be something new that they were going to do. But they've got a very bureaucratic process they have to follow. So the news, some of the news on this isn't going to drop to next week, but we got clues about where they're headed. So a week ago, they talked about what the guidance was going to be across the state and trying to conform with what's happening on the federal level with CDC with regard to mask requirements, distancing, and all those kinds of things. And they put together rules that just confused a lot of people. So it turns out that one of the points of last night's meeting wasn't to sort of set it straight. It was that they actually needed to go backward. They needed to undo what they had done, which they did do. And now they've got a go forward strategy. What that won't happen, I guess, until next week. And then when they do that next meeting, we understand they're going to lay out a framework that is much more aligned to CDC guidelines. But so you're going to have basically masking requirements. A lot of these requirements are going to basically be relaxed or undone entirely, except the hints that we're getting is that they would keep in place at least the masking requirements in K-12 schools. Again, we're kind of scratching our head on that one, since of course little kids or kids in our public school system are over the age of 12 are going to be eligible to have vaccination. And we think we'll probably be very successful with pretty broadly subscribed to compliance with that. Again, it's not required, but we think a lot of people will do it. But then for those kids that are under 12, as we know, it's been reiterated many, many times during this crisis, that are the least likely to transmit or contract the virus. So the idea that we'd be stuck with having to do the mask requirement is something that's of some consternation to, I know, some of the districts across the state, but it kind of looks like where they would be headed. We sent an email last Friday to Dr. Naomi Bardock, who, as many people know, is the major player at the state level on determining how we're going to adapt any of the rules that we have to public education, and just inquired with her about sort of the barriers and the plexiglass and the distance, even the distance requirement, which that the guidance still is 6 feet. It allows you to go to 3. We need that to be changed. And that if we're going to get going, in person, full-time in person in the fall, we need there to be modifications to that match what they're doing for everybody else. When the governor puts out statewide that everything's going back to normal or we're reopening completely, it sets us up in a very weird place with communities and parents, because if we're still doing masks and all this stuff, they basically will be convinced that we're just being, difficult about this, when in fact it sounds like they may be applying rules to us that they're not applying to everybody else. So we're really pushing for some uniformity there. Dr. Bardock said, look, as soon as that guidance comes out in very short order, they'll be doing modifications statewide as well. And all of that's still under consideration. So we'll see where that goes. I just wanted to update people that, if you looked at the news last week, you got one impression. If you looked at the news today that talked about that they really didn't do anything, they just reversed their action, you'd still be confused. This gives you a little clarity that we think there's more changes to come. But I think as it relates to masks, we're probably going to have them at least for the foreseeable future. Perhaps they might change it again as we get closer to the fall.
Well, I guess it can be a little bit like the weather sometimes with guidance throughout this pandemic is one thing one week, one thing the next. And one of the reasons why we offer this show to try to keep everybody up to date on the latest in those matters. So thanks for sharing that, Kevin. And we're certainly going to keep people updated as that starts to become more clear. I'll just wanted to throw in a topic here. We talk often about the digital divide. One of the great things, I suppose, if you want to look for silver lining out of this pandemic, is that everyone's anxious to bridge the digital divide, the homework gap. So we've seen the federal government step up with some stimulus action towards that. We've seen the FCC step up and help in their own way. We remember the Biden infrastructure plan. We discussed that when it was launched. There was $100 billion proposed in there to connect every American. Just so you know that debate is still going on back in DC, and your advocacy is still needed. A couple of things that 100 billion was whittled down to 65 billion. And when folks came out with that initial 100 billion, they were saying that they didn't know if that was enough. So we're already 35 billion below that mark. But at least it's still in there. I will say the other big debate is the connectivity speed that they're saying is the minimum connectivity standard for Americans. The last time the FCC declared this speed, it was 25 down, 25 megs down and 3 up, which really doesn't even support a video call like the one we're on right now. So when you fast forward the clock today, they're saying 100 down and 100 up. It sounds like a lot, but remember, by the time this fiber, the trenches are dug, the fiber is laid, and you're able to turn the switches on this money, we're going to be years down the road, and that's going to serve us for years. So when you think about how fast technology moves, I am concerned that 100 meg down and 100 meg up isn't quite enough. And there are folks back in DC that are advocating for 1,000. So I will just say, you make your call on this. I don't want to tell everybody what to think, but definitely spend some time looking into it, think it through, talk to your legislature, your local folks that are going to help you advocate back in DC for the right connectivity speed. So when the fiber is laid, you're going to get the most bang for that buck in your communities. Something to definitely be worried about. Just because we've heard of these big funding dollars come in doesn't mean the advocacy job is done. So make sure you do your research and advocate if you feel compelled to do so. So with that, Kevin, just want to talk about the state budget. I know there's some negotiations going on there. Can you share that with us, please?
Yeah, before I get there, I wanted to make a comment about your last point. So one of the things that's kind of a struggle is that we clearly want to advocate for modernization of that and having speeds that are actually going to do well by kids. We can actually get on, you can have the right numbers of people that are on in a school, that there's capacity there to do the modern kind of computing and connectivity and everything that's required. At the same time, with regard to the ESSER money, for example, that allows you the ESSER money, and then as you know, and you've talked about on this program, there's a bunch of FCC dollars that are going to be made available too. That as people access some of these pots of money, there are going to be minimums in terms of speeds that when you go out and actually spend money, they're not going to reimburse you for speeds they don't want you buying a dinosaur. They don't want you. But if you're in some rural areas where the service provider has pretty low speeds and you're not even at that level and you want to subscribe to it, there is a danger if they're not going to allow you to have money to subscribe to things that are slower. So it's like this dilemma a district's in, is that we want to advocate for higher speed levels, but we also don't want to trap ourselves in situations where we wouldn't be able to use the money to access whatever's available now. Is that's kind of I kind of see a problem with that, given the stuff that you've been sending to me about what's going on in DC.
Yeah, and Kevin, it's one of the traps with technology is when you think about what you need today in today's world, if you build for what you need today, by the time you actually get it installed and turn it on, it's already obsolete or it's already behind. So you really need to be looking down the road. We need to look down the road 10 years is the way I see this, because fiber in the ground, you don't just go dig new trenches and put new fiber in. that's going to have that sort of capacity. So I would just say this is something that's a really important decision that we all need to make right now, because this is the first time this has ever happened. We're going to try to run fiber to everyone, and it's going to need to last us quite a while. So I would say aiming north of 100, in my humble opinion, would probably be the best thing to do. If you look around and at the type of things that we're doing on the internet today that we weren't doing 3 years ago, every 3 years things change so much. So I would say if you want to be able to offer services, VR tours and HD video to your students and teachers at home, these are important things. If you want to really connect people, distance learning, and even in your communities at your school sites, the more capacity we have, the less restricted we'll be as that equipment and fiber gets older.
Great. So let me jump into the budget negotiations you referenced. So we're at this place where the legislature just last week finalized their version of the budget. And in a lot of ways, they really listened to us. They responded to COLA across the board to all programs. They're helping with STIRS and PERS issues that we didn't anticipate. They're even addressing the issues I think I mentioned last week, the issue on unemployment insurance that we had raised. So they're being responsive to a lot of really key things that we wanted. That's great. But now they go downstairs, as we call it, to the corner office of the Capitol building where the governor's office is, and they negotiate with the governor over where they're going to be headed. That is occurring right now. We will get an on-time budget next Tuesday, I promise, because they don't get paid if we don't. And then we're going to be out in the field describing what's going on with that budget. The week of the 28th, our budget workshops will start. But for the time being, probably the most critical issue right now that is being debated is that issue that Barrett covered. We sort of get a solution on what that language is going to look like, and they're debating it as we speak right now. So what's going to get in that trader bill language? Some of these other little funding fights are going to be amongst the issues we talk about. And then on today's agenda, a little bit later, I'm going to talk a little bit about what's going on with school nutrition, because there's some funding issues there that are tied to this budget. That's all good news.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, we'll look forward to more there. And I just wanted to follow up on a story from last week. We talked about the chip shortage, the looming device shortage, the dollars that are coming, getting your orders in early. We had that conversation last week. If you haven't watched it, I would definitely go back and take a look. But the Senate actually stepped up this week and passed a bill, the Endless Frontier Act, that basically brings in $50 billion to build out our semiconductor capacity within the U.S. so we could build more of our own chips to avoid this down the road. It would take a while to see that impact, but at least we're trying to make some steps forward. There's also dollars in there to make regional tech hubs. So there's more, technology centers around the U.S. rather than just the big usual suspects that you've seen around the U.S. in the past. So, they're calling it a sort of, world competitive legislation. Now, this is past the Senate. There's a little bit of debate that needs to happen, obviously, but, in DC to see this through. But, just so again, when we talk about advocacy, there are some big things that will impact you and, potentially our future. There's also technology training dollars in there to get folks the skills they need to work in these tech jobs. So again, take a look at that, see if it's something that you want to advocate for. It is something that's being debated right now, and we could use your support if you feel like you want to support that. So Kevin, you mentioned talking about school nutrition. Please let us know what's going on with funding there.
It's really exciting that in the legislature's version of the budget, they kind of up the ante, if you will, on what we're going to do on school nutrition. I mean, the governor's budget proposal wasn't bad because he pays attention to that issue by starting the idea down the road of universal access to school meals in those areas of really high poverty. The legislature goes beyond that and says, we need to make it, covering the cost of offering breakfast and lunch to all kids. So regardless of where they are income wise, that's a $650 million ongoing investment. I think there is some legitimate concerns by leaders in the school nutrition community that, when they talk about this rhetoric and when the budget ended up getting negotiated, will we end up with an ongoing funding stream? Because the last thing we need is, the kind of money that holds that out there that doesn't become sustainable over time. We want to make sure it's really an ongoing commitment. But the governor had $80 million also in his budget proposal, one-time money that would go for kitchen upgrades. The legislature comes in with $200 million. So in every respect regarding child nutrition, including, by the way, that increase in the state meal reimbursement rate the legislature does more in that area. The governor does well by that area as well. All of these things are good. And as I've mentioned probably in prior broadcasts, it's way overdue. I mean, the linkage between child nutrition and learning for these kids is really, really clear. And the fact that the legislature and the governor are both sort of arguing about who loves this program the most, that's a good argument. We love it when they get into that argument. So hopefully the outcome will be good. And obviously we'll be reporting on that and everything else when the Budget Act gets done next week.
Excellent. Looking forward to that, Kevin. And again, if you haven't yet, make sure you go on the Capital Advisors website, register for those budget update workshops on the final budget that you'll all be enacting and living with next year. So looking forward to that. Thanks so much for your time this week, Kevin. And we'll look forward to more updates on these hot issues next week.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tim.
So thanks again for joining us for another week of this broadcast.
And I just want to take a moment to remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel and share this out over social media. Again, you're our marketing team. I'll also finish by saying, if you have some questions, please send them our way. We'd be happy to address them on a future broadcast. So with that, thanks everybody, and we'll talk soon.